Well, today we're talking about the controversy that Trinity Western University has raised by applying to open a Christian law school in Canada. Is the alternative to go godless in legal education? Justin Trottier thinks that's the way to go. He is a leader with the Canadian Secular Alliance. And John Stackhouse is a professor of theology and culture at Regent College in British Columbia. And Bryan Sandberg is a recent graduate of Trinity Western's undergrad program in BC. So thank you all for being here. And gentlemen, let's start with this topic of, can Canada tolerate an evangelical Christian law school? Justin, you think no. Why?
Well, for me, the issue isn't whether there should be law schools which are Christian or law schools which have other kinds of religious orientations. The issue really is with this oath, that to be a participant, a student, or a faculty member at this particular school, you have to pledge not to engage in sex outside of marriage, or if you're gay, you can't even engage in sex within marriage. And what this effectively does is it creates a queer quota. So if you're a gay or a lesbian, there are fewer law school openings that you can compete for than if you're a straight Canadian. So to me, the issue is, if we're going to have a law system which is public, I mean, law isn't private. You know, if you get trained as a lawyer, it's not like being a car salesman or a marketing exec, for example. You're practicing law within a court system which is fully public. So to me, the question is, if that's the case, should there be law schools that train students to practice law within an environment which does discriminate, which does violate, I think, the principles and values of Canadian society? Okay,
let's go to John Stackhouse. What is your opinion on what this debate, how this debate is unfolding?
Well, it's interesting, Laura, that the main question is not actually being debated by either side, namely whether Trinity Western University can actually offer competent training in the law. No one's actually arguing about that. Trinity Western has met all the criteria necessary to offer legal education. Everybody seems to stipulate to that. So instead, we have to argue at the level at which Mr. Trottier, I think, has correctly identified the issues, which are the softer areas of what's the right thing to do. It's not even a question of what the legal thing is to do. It's the question of whether lawyers across the country are happy or even content or even able to tolerate the idea of a law school whose approach and whose values differ from the majority, at least the majority as we see it today.
So, John, let's take this a step further, because as Justin pointed out, it is the oath, or it's a code of conduct. It's something they aspire to. That they will live within these evangelical understandings of how sex, and there's many things. It's like a 5-page covenant of all kinds of great lifestyle values, but that one line, those 7 words, is like inflamed this debate. Can a faith community have a belief system like that when they want to be public?
Well, I think the public question really isn't at issue. I mean, selling used cars is a public issue as well. I mean, all of this is public stuff. So I think those are red herrings. But I think the really substantive question is whether Trinity Western needs to require this kind of behavior in order to fulfill its mission. The question is whether things are mission critical. Can Trinity Western offer the kind of education it wants to offer and be indifferent to how students are spending their sexual lives? Trinity Western is saying, we're not just trying to convey legal information, anybody can do that, we're actually trying instead to form a certain kind of person. And for us, that involves the whole person, including sexual relationships. So that's really the issue, is whether Trinity Western could truly offer a Christian education and not care what people are doing in their sexual lives. Trinity Western has the burden of proof to show that it can't do that job without having these kinds of restrictions. And that's where I think the debate is most interestingly joined.
Can we step back for a second? Because we've been really debating the specific context of a Christian law school. But we already have anti-discrimination provisions in other parts of our life. So, for example, if the owner of an apartment were to throw out a gay or lesbian couple because he found out that they had been engaging in sex, that would clearly be against the Human Rights Code. If a restaurant threw out a gay couple because they had engaged in intimacy in the restaurant, that would clearly be against the Human Rights Code. So why is it that it's okay for a Christian law school to have the same kind of discriminatory policies that wouldn't be allowed in these other kinds of contexts? What's unique about the law school?
I think Mr. Trottier has put his finger on exactly the right question. Is running a law school the same thing as running a restaurant? If it's the same thing, then his logic follows. But if, in fact, the formation of people through an educational institution like Trinity Western does, in fact, mandate that everyone in the community abides by a certain set of behavioral standards, then you aren't just selling fish and chips. You're doing something that's much more complicated. And that may mean that the people involved have a higher and more complex standard of common behavior. That's the issue.
Okay, and so Justin, what's happening here is you have a faith community in Canada wanting the freedom to form its students and its people by their community standards, just like a Catholic school, when it's shaping priests, they want them along this certain lines. What's wrong with that?
What's wrong with that is the millions of dollars in public subsidies that go to these institutions. They call them private institutions, but they get millions of dollars in federal, provincial, and city grants.
Okay, that's Trinity Western donations. Okay, but Trinity Western, all of the Christian universities across Canada are totally donor and tuition driven. So yes, a donor gets that tax receipt at the end of the year, but you can't pull out the charitable plank in Canada.
Plan, which is the federal government, has given millions of dollars to Trinity Western University and other Christian, supposedly private universities.
Once in a while, there's been a special grant for a building.
I've looked at their tax returns for the last 5 years. Every year, there's millions of dollars in public grants. Okay. Now, granted, it's a minority of the funding. I'm not disputing that.
Yeah, it's a very small portion.
But it does make a difference. Not to mention tax credits to buy textbooks, not to mention special applications for loans that only public institutions get, as well as Christian private schools. So there's a lot of benefits that they're getting.
So,
sure,
but
I don't
they
think
are
there's any
providing
trouble with
public
that.
education. Sorry, John, I'm interrupting you there.
Well, I was just going to say that I don't think we have to argue about how much money they get. I think Mr. Trottier is right. If they get a single dollar of public funding, they're obliged to the public that sends them the money. So the question is whether the Canadian public thinks that Canadian life will be better off having a law school, most of whose dollars, in fact, don't come from the public, that do come from donors. So you can argue exactly the opposite to say that, in fact, Trinity Western is offering a public service by offering a law school, most of the funding of which does not come from the public purse. So that can be an either-or kind of question.
Well, in terms of
the fundamental question is the one that Mr. Trottier suggests, which is, can Trinity Western do what it's trying to do and not regulate people's sexual lives? That's the question.
Okay, we need to go to someone who's been to Trinity now and who has a very interesting perspective on the sexual orientation question. Bryan Sandberg is in Calgary. And Bryan, thank you very much for being with us.
Well, thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Well, you are a recent graduate of Trinity Western University, so, you know, you are exactly who we need to hear from. And it is, you know, you came out at Trinity Western as a gay student, and it is their community lifestyle covenant which asks people not to participate in gay sex. That has been so controversial, any sex outside of marriage. So can you share with us, what was your experience like raising your hand in that climate and saying, I'm gay, I'm going to school here?
Well, first let me say that the reason that I went to a Christian private school in the first place was because I did not believe that myself as a gay student should face less choices in terms of my education. And I thought, if I wasn't gay, I was going to go to a private Christian school, and I thought just because I am gay, I should still be able to do that. And so I went to Trinity Western. Being gay has been really important to me my whole life. It's part of my identity. And when I went there, I was just very honest with myself. I thought that it was necessary to be open in order to make sure that I had the kind of quality of emotional life that I felt I needed to be happy there. And people there just really embraced me with open arms. I think really, even though I am a gay Christian, I think I am ideologically in line with most of the things that people believe at Trinity. And I still see myself as a Christian. I don't see myself as less of a Christian just because I am gay. I see myself maybe a little bit different than other people, but that doesn't mean I'm less than the other people who are there.
Bryan, do you think Trinity Western can be trusted with a law school?
I don't see any reason why Trinity Western wouldn't be trusted with a law school. We're trusted with the School of Nursing. We're trusted with the School of Education. We're trusted with the School of Business. We're trusted with the School of the Arts. We're trusted with all kinds of schools, and I don't see why now there would suddenly be a big controversy over another school because we somehow can't be trusted with that one. I don't think it's very consistent.
Okay. So I was very touched by your 17-page letter, I think it was, when you sat down and you read this to the guys in the dorm. Tell me about that experience.
That was a really scary experience for me at first because I am very familiar with what religious-based homophobia is like. I grew up suicidal in my own home. I've had my mom try to cast a demon out of me. And going to another Christian university is like, I don't know if I've left out of the frying pan into the fire kind of situation. So I wasn't really sure what I was getting into at that point. That was still my first semester of university. And actually, before I even read that letter, I remember I ran away from the dorm meeting because I was so scared. And what happened was my RA went out and looked for me. And he just found me and he started praying for me and he said, you need to come back and you need to share this with those guys. And I did. I told them my story and they were all very supportive of me. And one of them said, what can we do to help? How can we be supportive of you? And I realized that, I had really misjudged people because of where I had come from, because of my previous experiences. And I needed to judge these people based on who they were and not on the narrative that had been fed to me from my previous experiences.
Okay. Bryan, thank you for those opinions. Now, John and Justin, I want to go back to you because here you have, in that Christian and evangelically defined Christian environment, you have someone with differing views of the community covenant saying, I got along just fine. In fact, it was healthy for me to choose to go into that environment. Justin, isn't that what we want in Canada? That kind of Christian belief being able to sit and exist in a differing environment?
And I'm certainly glad that Bryan had a positive experience, and I know that there are a number of gay students who have gone to Trinity Western and have had similarly positive experiences, but I'm also concerned about gay students that have tried to start and publicize a gay student society on campus and have felt threatened and have felt as though they had to stay in the closet.
Can I
and
please
that they weren't
interrupt
able
here?
to organize those meetings.
We have a gay student society. I started it last semester, and it's very open. We have faculty members. The president's interns come to some of our meetings. We have staff members that come from different departments. And we actually have a meeting that is, I think, tonight, and we have, dozens and dozens of people that are planning to come. So I don't, there have been incidents in the past, certainly, and I've heard of these incidents, and I think that they are a difficult thing that Trinity Western has to come to terms with moving forward. But right now, things have been very healthy.
So there are reports from students that they have felt threatened, that they have been told that they're going to hell in classes, that they have felt like they couldn't publicize that they were planning to attend these meetings that you're describing?
Yes,
are you saying
I've
that
heard
that doesn't
those
exist?
stories. I've heard some of those stories. This is not recent Trinity Western, though. Okay.
John, let's go to you as a professor in the Christian university culture in Canada as well. Is this the future for trying to include Christianity into Canadian issues?
It is a very complex issue, isn't it, Lorna? I mean, I think Mr. Trottier and Bryan as well are raising very good issues that are part of a complex here. I've been trying to think of an analogy, and for me, suppose we had, for instance, a law school in Canada that was run by people whose ideology included pacifism. And suppose Canada was drawn into another war, a big war like World War II, and most public opinion was strongly in favor of the war. And this pacifist law school said, look, we've proven that we can educate people competently in the law, but while you're here, we ask you, even if you're a member of the armed forces, that you abide by our community covenant and not engage in any warlike activity. We don't expect you to go on to target practice on the weekends. We don't expect you to join your unit on your holidays. While you're here, please abide by the clearly expressed moral covenant of this school, because we think it's important to the kind of teaching of law that we're trying to engage in. I'd like to think that Canada could tolerate something like that. We might even see it as being a good thing that we have a law school or two or three that add different values to the mix of our culture, rather than everything having to look like UBC or Toronto or Queens.
Well, Christians aren't the only ones who have values that might add to the mix. I wonder what your thinking would be if there was, say, a Muslim Sharia law-based law school that wanted to get started, or let's say a gay law school that wanted to prevent Christians from attending, so long as they were going to attend church while they were students of that gay law school. I know that sounds kind of ridiculous, but on what grounds could you oppose that while you continue to support a Christian law school?
Okay, John,
Well, I think that's exactly the right question to ask, is what if the shoe is on the other foot? That's why I picked pacifism as an example, because the law school I have in mind in that regard is a Jain law school, not a Christian pacifist, but an Indian one. The same thing would be true of a Hindu school that required everybody, whatever their personal convictions, to abide by vegetarian eating standards while they were at that law school. I think the question with Sharia is such a hot-button issue, I'm deliberately sidestepping it because it actually involves us in another whole level of complexity about the law. But I'm hoping Mr. Trottier and others can see that I'm trying to find legitimate parallels to help us see that people who come to Trinity Western come in with their eyes open. They know what's being asked of them, and there should be a pedagogically sound reason for everything Trinity asks of its students. Now, if that's not the case, and if Trinity Western is just arbitrarily asking everybody there to wear the color blue on Tuesdays, then I think they're being ridiculously discriminatory. If instead they can show, however, that part of their pedagogical concern is to educate people in traditional Christian mores, then I think they ought to be allowed to do it.
Then I think there's common ground here, because there are a number of Christian law schools, I'm thinking in the States, Brigham Young Law School, for example, which, while they do have a certain preference for folks who are believing in their version of religion, they do have a non-discrimination policy at the same time. And I don't think, last I checked, Trinity Western had a non-discrimination policy or had a robust non-discrimination policy. There may be a middle ground there where you can have your Christian law school, or your Christian university for that matter, but you can do it in such a way that you are practicing equality, which I think is a core Canadian value.
All right.
Well, we don't disagree. I think the difference, though, is that Trinity Western doesn't discriminate against anybody. What it does say is that whoever you are, whatever your views, please participate in the community this way. That's the question. It's not about discrimination. It's about whether the kinds of requirements that Trinity puts upon you, whether it's in the classroom or out of the classroom, are pedagogically driven. If it's mission driven, then I think it's defensible and they should be allowed to proceed.
Thus, the freedom of religion argument that has been unfolding all around this as Trinity battles the different law societies across Canada. Okay, gentlemen, thank you, all three of you. Bryan in Calgary, John in Vancouver, and Justin here in the studio. This argument is not going to be going away very soon for Trinity or for the rest of Canada as we work out what it is to be good neighbors in this country. Thank you all very much.
Good to talk to you.
Thank you.
Well, let's keep this debate going on our Context Facebook page, too. You can see some questions there and put in your points of view and meet a whole bunch more people who would like to dialogue with you about this. So thank you very much. Well, Justin Trottier is a board member with the Canadian Secular Alliance, and John Stackhouse is professor and author at Regent College, and Bryan Sandberg is a recent grad of Trinity Western University in British Columbia.